Yeah, so when we had talked about this the other day, what I was trying to convey was my interpretation of what drives demand in certain markets. And I think I think this is universally applicable to Airbnbs and short-term rentals. I look at two different drivers of demand. One is sort of asset-based demand, and the second is location-based demand. So
So
to
one
me,
is driven by the asset, one is driven by the location.
right.
Yeah.
So to me, the location-based demand would be having a rental in a beach town, or having a rental near a ski resort, or having a rental near a big water park like Atlantic City.
Soon to be.
Yeah. So that type of demand is you're when you're chasing that type of demand, you're saying I'm investing in a particular area. And by the way, it doesn't have to be specifically tourism driven. It could be doing something near New York City because you're going to cater to business travelers, and there are a lot of hotels that take that approach. And to me, location-based demand is more agnostic to what it is that you're actually buying, and focusing much more so on where it is that you are buying that asset.
Yeah, I almost think of another way to say it is that regardless of what you have there, people will go there. So you could have an amazing, 8-bedroom house in an amazing location in that, city or whatever it is, or you could have a 1-bedroom apartment in a rundown area. There will still be demand for those assets.
Right. And I think your occupancy and your pricing there is going to be primarily a function of the supply and demand of that local market. And I would contrast all of this with what I'm calling asset-based demand, which is the demand that comes from having a cool or unique, or for some generally amenity-driven reason, an attractive property. So,
regardless of the location.
Regardless of the location. So, and to be clear, you can have an approach that is focused on both asset-based demand and location-based demand. But generally, it's going to be, we'll get into that in
yeah, you could have a cool house in a cool location for sure.
And you can have a terrible asset in a terrible location. In most cases, you're going to fall somewhere in between there. So just to further discuss the asset-based demand a little bit, I generally think of that as being either amenity-driven or aesthetics and design-driven. So if you have a house, a 5-bedroom house that has a pool, a hot tub, a tennis court, a basketball court, and a sick backyard and deck, that is going to appeal to people on the basis of those features, those amenities, and that is specific to that asset. People are going to probably chase that rental down no matter where it's located, although there will be location-based factors that will obviously affect the pricing. That asset could do well in many different locations, but it's probably going to do better if that also happens to be located right next to a beach or right next to a mountain. So that's sort of the framework for at least one lens through which we're going to be evaluating future STR markets.
And I think
individual assets within those markets.
Yeah, I think it's a really useful way to think about it, because if I think back on what I've done with short-term rentals, or even, like hospitality space in general, I think that that's really been borne out. I have, when I started, I had a lot of short-term rentals in Union City, which is in Hudson County, kind of directly across the Hudson River from New York. And the stuff that I was renting out was, not super high quality. It was, like rooms in an old apartment that was maybe, renovated kind of in a not very extensive way. And all the demand that I saw was for people coming that wanted to live there, to be in New York, to be near New York. And so in that sense, it was entirely location driven. Like the room itself mattered almost not at all, just that there was a room.
Well, one thing I want to point out, though, is I think that when you do either one of, like, if you want to be asset focused, you still focus a little bit on location. If you want to be location focused, you still focus a little bit on the demand. So in the context of what you're talking about with Union City, to the extent that you were being purposeful about what you were buying, you were obviously buying in Union City because you wanted to be close to Manhattan. That was your whole underlying thesis. But once you got into the thick of buying stuff, you were also thinking about things from an asset-based perspective in terms of, this is a 7-bedroom house or a 5-bedroom house, that's going to be more lucrative than buying a 3-bedroom house or a 2-bedroom house.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And I think that buying in Union City versus Jersey City versus Manhattan, which all have kind of the same location appeal, the reason why we bought in Union City was because the pricing in Union City was a lot more attractive. So in that case, I was very concerned about the location specifically of Union City versus other places, because I was able to kind of choose. I think another way of saying it is that, if you're from an economic perspective, if you're saying I want to buy, I'm really seeking out a certain location. The price, the amount that you'll make at that location, as you said before, is driven by kind of the global demand for that location. So your sensitivity towards, your basis almost for these properties might be a little bit higher, because you're thinking, well, I can't really drive, I'm not going to really drive demand by how great my asset is. I mean, I might to some extent, but the demand is really there for the location. So sure, if I have a really nice asset in a great location, that'll do better than a not as nice asset in a great location. But presumably, you can't really drive, you're not going to be really driving that much demand to the location itself, because its location is what it is. Whereas the opposite extreme being that in a completely, if you have a place in the middle of nowhere, you are creating the demand. You're driving people are not going to go to that place except to go to your specific place because your place is so great. So perhaps in that case, you could be a little bit more agnostic about the basis or the cost, because you're thinking, well, I'm driving that demand. So like every dollar I spend or put in or whatever might actually correlate in some way to increased revenue.
So we've touched, I think this was a little bit of an aside on demand drivers for STRs. I think the importance of having that conversation is that is the large driving force behind what your average nightly rates are going to look like, what your occupancy is going to look like, and it's ultimately going to trickle down to every other metric that is going to determine whether a property is profitable or not.
Don't forget to visit us at BxBreakRealEstate.com for free content to help you along your real estate journey and to follow along on our projects. Subscribe and rate us on your favorite podcast app, and engage with us online via Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and BxBreakRealEstate.com. See you next time on the Brick by Brick podcast.